Hello everybody! I wanted to take this opportunity to showcase a couple of swords that I haven't really talked about that much on the channel, and then also go over what I think the advantages are of a single-edged sword and what the advantages are of a double-edged sword, and I think some of them will surprise you. So first let me introduce all of the blades, and then we'll go over what the advantages and disadvantages are of having a single edge versus a double edge. This first one here is a Kriegsmesser, and this is the new cold steel example of a Kriegsmesser. It's not new as in it's just come out, but they had an older version which was much worse, and this actually feels pretty dang good. And as you can see, there is just a single edge. There is no back edge or false edge. This here is a custom sword that I had made, and it is my take on the High Elven Lord of the Rings sword. I think was based off of a Nagamaki. One of the characteristics of a Nagamaki is that the handle is quite long, sometimes up to half of the overall size of the sword. I did some testing with a handle that long where the handle was half of the size of the sword, and I felt personally that it got in the way a little too much. So when I designed this sword, I shrunk the handle down a little bit, increased the blade length a little bit, and overall the sword is quite long. So if you look at the total length, it is longer than this Kriegsmesser, but the blade length itself is actually a bit shorter than the Kriegsmesser. I don't know if people would actually still classify this as a Nagamaki. They might classify it kind of as an Odachi, but it is quite unique in its own style. The blade is wider than what you would see from most Nodachi or most Nagamaki. And something that I wanted was the last 8 inches or so actually does have a false edge, and this is sharp, and so you can do some false edge cuts with this. This here is the recently reviewed Dark Sword Armory Black Prince, and this will be the example of a standard longsword for this, 2 edges with a grip that could be held pretty much either way. This is the LK Chen Town Guard sword, and you can see it also has 2 edges. However, due to the hilt construction, you will always present the same edge forward. Now let's talk about some of the advantages of having a single edge, and then we'll talk about some of the advantages of having 2 edges. And there's one advantage that people say you often get from 2 edges that I actually disagree with and might actually call a disadvantage. A couple advantages of a single edge. First off, if you're taking this weapon with you on campaign or an adventure or whatever it is, you only have one edge that you need to worry about and maintain. Sharpening 2 edges is going to take twice as long. Now the other thing on this is that because there's only one edge, you can have a very nice edge angle where you go from the spine, which is the thickest part, and go all the way down to the edge, and you have a very shallow angle, and so this can make for a very smooth cut. In comparison to a longsword, the thickest part is not going to be the back because there is no back. The thickest part is going to be the central ridge. And so then here, we only have about half as much distance to go from the thickest part to the edge. And so it's going to be a steeper angle, which typically makes the cuts a little bit harder. Now, what is the thing that everybody says that is an advantage of 2 edges that I disagree with? Having 2 edges gives you more durability, because if for some reason one edge gets damaged, you can just turn the sword around and you still have another edge that is ready to go. Well, yes and no. If one edge gets dulled for some reason, yes, you could flip it around and you have another edge that could be sharp. However, as we have already discussed, there are some swords that have 2 edges that you cannot just flip around. So then why on earth would you have a sword where it's locked into your hand in a single position if you can't flip it around and get that advantage? What's the point? Well, actually, I don't think that having 2 edges makes the sword more durable. I would actually go so far as to say having a sword with 2 edges could make it less durable if used incorrectly. If you guys have seen Matthew Jensen, he does a lot of sword destruction tests, and one of the things he does that almost always destroys the sword is he will bang up one edge pretty good, and then he'll turn the blade around and whack it, and that often will push the blade to failure and break it. Once one edge is damaged significantly, flipping it around can really just catastrophically push the sword to the limit and destroy it altogether. So if you happen to be using a single-edged sword, like if you're using a katana or your standard Odachi, Nagamaki, Kriegsmesser, that's never really going to happen. You're not going to be damaging your sword and then flipping it around and hitting. But I could easily see that take place with a longsword, where someone goes, oh, my edge is damaged, let me flip it around. And then by doing so, they actually destroy their sword altogether. Having the 2 edges could give a false sense of security on how durable your sword is. And so with that in mind, I actually think it makes more sense to decide which edge is going to permanently be your true edge, and always keep that edge facing forward. And if that edge gets damaged, don't flip your sword around, because then you could go from a damaged edge to a completely broken sword. If having 2 edges doesn't actually give you more durability, what then is the point? Well, the point is partially the point. So by having two edges on the point, you can make it easier to thrust where there's less resistance, and the edges here will help slide the sword in. The other major advantage is that having two edges gives you multiple lines of attack that you don't really have with only a single edge. If you look at a lot of historical single-edged swords, you will often find that the last little bit of the sword has a false edge on it so that you can do some additional cuts from additional angles that you wouldn't be able to do with just a single edge. You find that, for example, on many historical falchions, messers. This is an example of a reverse-edged falchion. Typically, the edge is on the outside of the curve, which would be here, and this one has the edge on the inside of the curve. But it also has a false edge here, which again will help with the thrust, but then also allows you to do cuts on both sides. Going back to this type of sword with two edges where you're completely locked in, some people might think that this is a disadvantage because now they can't flip the sword around if their edge gets dulled. However, this construction overall will help durability in the long term, and you still get all the additional penetrative power in the point, and you can still do your false edge cuts. One other point that I'd like to add about the two edges is when you are doing a combination of cuts, I don't have a whole lot of room, but let's say I was going to do a diagonal down cut and then a diagonal up cut on the same plane. With the Kriegsmesser, I would do my cut, I then have to turn my wrists and do the cut again. With a sword that has two edges, you can actually save a little bit of time because you don't need to turn your wrists. You can do the cut, and then without moving your hands at all, you can cut back. When I'm doing double cuts where I cut the bottom bottle and then cut the top bottle, this is one of the easiest double cuts for me to do with a two-handed sword because it's so quick. I don't have to move my wrists or anything. It's just very easy to go along the same plane. Hope that was fun to see a couple of additional swords and gave you guys some things to think about the advantages and disadvantages of a single edge versus a double edge, and the fact that having two edges on your sword doesn't make your sword more durable. It just gives you more options in the attack.